We left Philadelphia by steamboat at 6 o'clock one very cold morning and turned our faces towards Washington.
I am travelling south, leaving the city of brotherly love, and am now approaching the city of power and politics.
We're steaming along the Potomac River in a pleasure boat, which is rather different from the ship that Dickens would have come along on, but I love it.
As well as being a writer of fiction such as Barnaby Rudge and Bleak House, Charles Dickens was also a political journalist. He'd sat for hours in the Houses of Parliament. As he travelled down the east coast of America on the journey he immortalised in his book, American Notes, he was becoming increasingly upset by both slavery and the constant tobacco spitting. But visiting the political capital of such a great nation as America was not to be sneezed at. Travelling in his footsteps, I'm bracing myself for an experience of politics, tobacco farming, and a visit to a gun range.
We reached Washington at 6:30 that evening and had upon the way a beautiful view of the Capitol, which is a fine building of the Corinthian order placed upon a noble and commanding eminence. Arrived at the hotel, I saw no more of the place that night, being very tired and glad to get to bed.
My billet in this political town is a very grand hotel. It's built on the same site as the original hotel that Dickens stayed in on his trip, and it pulsates with history. The last meeting between the North and South was held here as they tried in vain to avoid the Civil War. This is where new presidents stay before they enter the White House, just up the road. It's a sumptuous berth in a city that reeks of intrigue, assassination and scandal.
It is sometimes called the City of Magnificent Distances, but it might, with greater propriety, be termed the City of Magnificent Intentions.
This is Miriam Margulies reporting for Dickens in America from the White House. And this is as near to the seat of democracy as I'm allowed to get.
The President's mansion is more like an English clubhouse, both within and without, than any other kind of establishment with which I can compare it.
This city is like no other on my journey. Everywhere I look, there's a building demanding my attention, and the huge figures of Jefferson and Lincoln loom over me. I need to understand it, both as a city now and as the small town it was when Dickens visited in 1842.
Washington really was a swamp. When Dickens came through here, it was nothing but a backwater. This town was selected as the capital only as a compromise between North and South. And sometimes people now see it as a big city, the capital city in the United States. It really is not a big city. It's still hiding and trying to pretend, at times stick out its chest, puff itself up and say we're a big city, but it's never been and never will be. It's a city that is a creation in some ways, because who would choose to live here in a swamp with absolutely tropical weather in the summer and not all that pleasant weather in the winter? It's kind of gray and kind of misty cold.
It is very unhealthy here. Few people would live in Washington who were not obliged to reside here. And the tides of emigration and speculation, those rapid and regardless currents, are little likely to flow at any time towards such dull and sluggish water.
This is truly a laboratory for human behavior with regard to power and relationships and intrigue. There's just no end to it. And the fact that it's played out, oftentimes behind closed doors, makes it all the more compelling a story.
Away from the overbearing architecture, there are backwaters in Washington, and pretty ones at that. A canal boat ride, a perfect venue to ruminate on Dickens and his feelings about the city.
Washington, as Dickens kept noting, had no industry. The curious thing about Washington as a city, he kept saying, was that it only had the government, and it had none of the other things that great capitals have. Even when he came, it just had the Congress, the president, and the small bureaucracy that was the United States, and rooming houses. Nothing else at all. So it didn't seem powerful, and it certainly didn't seem wealthy either.
Mules are obsessed with their own self-preservation and their safety.
He thought Washington had no future. He keeps talking about the fact that the avenues go nowhere. And he means that not only spatially, but temporally. It's not just that there are all these streets that have been built with no buildings on them, because there's this grand plan, and the plan certainly is far in advance of the city itself. But he really doesn't think Washington is going to last. He says there's a compromise, which is true. The capital was moved here from Philadelphia in order to strike a compromise between the northern and southern states. And he felt that once that compromise was gotten beyond, that Washington would just close down and go away, that it was going to be a ruin. Dickens doesn't like representative democracy. That's really at the center of why he doesn't like Washington. He doesn't believe in representation. It's not so much that he didn't believe in the American system, because he doesn't like the House of Commons either.
No, he was quite scathing about that.
Quite scathing about both. And of course, he had been a shorthand reporter in the House of Commons all those years when he was a young man, so he had seen it firsthand. And he's constantly making fun of and satirizing the personal vanities, the narcissism of legislators, and adding to that the terrible venality of American legislators. He sees how much avarice is driving America, how many Americans are on the take. He sees sort of spitting and stealing as the two great American occupations, both of which repel him very much. The spitting especially. He says, never look down because of all the tobacco stains you're going to find on the floor.
Did I recognize in this assembly a body of men who, applying themselves in a new world to correct some of the falsehoods and vices of the old, are making laws for the common good, and had no party but their country? I saw in them the wheels that move the meanest perversion of virtuous political machinery, the worst tools ever wrought, despicable trickery at elections, underhanded tamperings with public offices, cowardly attacks upon opponents with scurrilous newspapers for shields and hired pens for daggers.
Washington generally is full of fascist architecture. And by that I mean big, public, monumental edifices that are there for us to marvel and feel very small besides. And it doesn't have the energy of the Victorian English public buildings.
Here, in Washington's very grand Library of Congress, there's quietness and peace, a far cry from the frenzy of politics and power that devours this city. And in this exhibition of American treasures, there are surprises as well.
Well, I never. In Treasures of America, we found Charles Dickens' walking stick. Oh, this was on his second tour, the walking stick. And the parts of Martin Chuzzlewit. Another cutlery set. I like to think of them being in Treasures of America, not just Treasures of England. The weather has turned here now, and it's cold. It's grey and cold and rather English weather. And to go along with that, I think the people have got slightly bleak as well, and everywhere there is security. It has to be the most impenetrable town I have ever been to. Great concrete blocks separating you off from one building to another. Places you mustn't go, people you mustn't talk to, things you mustn't see or do. It's a very scared town, and it feels it.
The fear level here is way out of line with the reality of any terrorist threat or any consequence that might come from someone behaving badly towards a politician. It's become an industry in and of itself, a fear industry, so that people understand that fear is part of the political process. Both candidates in our recent political presidential election have used fear, or the ability to say, I can protect you better than the other guy, as an element to say, I'm the better candidate for office. So fear is part of now the political process. It's part of our daily lives. It's part of the way that we relate to each other. It's just all around us.
And can you tell me what platform?
Track number 14.
"3 hours by train, far from the hothouse of Washington, lies Richmond, Virginia. This will be as far south as Dickens himself journeyed. His insurance wouldn't cover him further, and he didn't want to travel deeper into the America where slavery abounded.
I just love Dickens. I wore out 2 copies of David Copperfield. All of the characters in there are old friends of mine.
A Dickens fan here in the third-class carriage. It's extraordinary the places you run into admirers of my hero.
I can almost feel like I'm visiting the places in that book when they would go to Mr. Peggotty's boat by the seashore and all that kind of stuff, the house he lived in that used to be a boat. I can just picture myself in that book, and I really loved it.
Richmond, my first taste of the real South. This city was the capital of the Confederacy when they moved it up from Alabama, and it suffered greatly during the fighting of the Civil War. With little left of its original buildings, it's an odd town, a world away from Washington. But at the heart of its economy, as it was in Dickens' time, is tobacco. There are over 300 tobacco companies and a host of tobacconists in Richmond. They all sell the famous Virginian product, and the chewing tobacco which creates the tobacco-tinctured saliva that so infuriated Dickens as it covered every floor he trod upon.
Hello.
Hello. Do you have any chewing tobacco?
Yes, actually we do. We have some Oliver Twist.
Oliver Twist?
Yeah.
That's funny. I didn't expect it to be called Oliver Twist. I've never used this, actually, but we're making a program on Charles Dickens, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really? My father read Great Expectations to my brother, sister, and I when we were growing up. He read it to us every night.
You know what? I think I might try a bit.
As Washington may be called the headquarters of tobacco-tinctured saliva, the time has come when I must confess, without any disguise, that the prevalence of those 2 odious practices of chewing and expectorating began about this time to be anything but agreeable, and soon became most offensive and sickening.
I think it's perfectly horrible. To be honest.
Really?
The stranger will find it in its full bloom and glory, luxuriant in all its alarming recklessness in the South. The thing itself is an exaggeration of nastiness which cannot be outdone.
Some coffee, huh? Actually, she wants some coffee.
Blimey.
The tobacco crop is in, and in his curing barns, Michael Bailey, a 4th-generation grower, is drying and maturing the golden Virginia leaf before he makes it into cigarettes.
What is that?
That is the old curing barn that my grandparents used to cure tobacco in. The one that's falling down, my great-grandfather used to
Oh, I
cure
love
that.
that. And as far as we can see, it's all your land, is that right?
Mhm.
I want to grow something wild and unruly. I want to sleep on the hard ground in the comfort.
So this is a...
This is a curing barn. This has got Virginia tobacco in it. It takes 8 days to cure. And there she blows.
Woo!
That's pretty good stuff there, quality-wise.
Can I smell it?
Sure, it puts you in the face right in it. And take a big whiff.
That is beautiful, actually.
Best smell in the world.
It's so fresh.
It's the smell of money and smell of good tobacco.
It's a clean smell.
My great-grandfather was 97 when he passed away. He smoked all his life. He made his own corn liquor, and he chased Grandma with a cane until he died. So what did they say? Sex and drinking and smoking is bad for you in excess? Not necessarily. It's all just somebody's opinion. Well,
Oh, that is gorgeous.
if you cut that tree down and you split it, the inside of a red oak smells fabulous. But to smell the smoke, it's not very attractive. Same with tobacco.
How do you know when it's ready?
I'll walk up to a barn when it's almost dry. I'll smell it, and I'll feel the humidity blowing on my hands and know it's time to go on to a higher level. It's just kind of an instinct.
Who taught you all this?
Granddaddy taught me what little bit he would, so I kind of had to learn the hard way. Trial and error. There was some good barns and there was some bad barns, but I've been doing it for about 15 years now.
Well, we'll close it up for next year. How many cigarettes do you make a day?
Roughly 1 million
A day?
a day. We're making and selling probably 2.7, 2.8 billion cigarettes a year.
2.8 billion. Just you?
I'm a family operation out in the country. The American dream.
You can't get away from the fact that cigarettes kill millions of people.
I have always very strongly disapproved of tobacco, and Dickens obviously very strongly disapproved of spitting. In fact, his whole soul was revolted by it. And so when I saw the tobacco in great barns like that, I couldn't help thinking of the damage I think it causes people. But I did like Mike Bailey so much. I just thought, what a lovely person. And I'm afraid, rather like Dickens, the individual overrides everything for me. And so I forgave him. I was seduced by the charm of the man.
Americans put more people in prison per capita than any other nation on earth, 4 times more than England. The cost is enormous, both in terms of the individuals and in pure cash. I followed Dickens to the tombs of New York and the now decayed Eastern State Penitentiary of Philadelphia. This women's prison in Fluvanna is set in the countryside of Maryland, and it's one of the most technically advanced correctional facilities in America.
Fluvanna is a multi-custody facility, so we may have women here who are serving simply a 1-year sentence to death row.
I've never been in prison, but looking around, this looks a fairly pleasant place to be.
This is pleasant in this classroom because it's like business. It's like stepping outside of the prison. But when you go like in the wings and you have women that are aggravated and angry with life, it's much harder. It's not this nice.
I'm a parole and probation violator, and this stems from years of alcohol and substance abuse. You know, some people think that it's devastating to be here, but for me it was, you know, a rescue. I mean, it saved my life.
The idea of prison has really changed since Dickens' days. Certainly, probably American prisons, when they first were initiated here in America, they were probably very punitive. But there's a big difference now. I think most prisoners will feel that there is a value to rehabilitation and therapeutic programs.
I mean, you have all different walks of life in here. Yeah. I mean, you have people that are angry, people that are bitter, people that are forgiving, people that are caring. You know, the same people that are out there are people that are in here. You know, we're still people.
America, as a new and not overpopulated country, has in all her prisons the one great advantage of being able to find useful and profitable work for the inmates. Whereas in England, the prejudice against prison labor is naturally very strong. Even in the United States, the principle of bringing convict labor and free labor into a competition, which must obviously be to the disadvantage of the latter, has already found many opponents, whose number is not likely to diminish with access of years.
Do you end up making a pair of spectacles here?
They make lots of glasses here.
We make our own.
I think everybody in here, almost everybody in here is wearing glasses that they make.
My goodness. I don't suppose anybody would fit me for a pair of glasses.
We could try.
Right there. And 65. Haven't I got gorgeous eyes? Yes. What I really was impressed by was the woman's prison. And that was an inspiration. That was really a time when I felt that all the things that Dickens had raged against, the inhumanity of the justice system, the blindness of judges, the stupidity and crushingness of a system, had been changed. And I felt that if he had come to the prison that I saw, he would have been thrilled, as I was, because it glowed with humanity. And I saw no evidence of cruelty or despair.
Charles Dickens believed in the primacy of character. In all of his books, he talked about character, good character, bad character. There were evil people, there were good people. And he didn't write very much in terms of social justice, though you can read that into his works, that something's wrong with the system. Basically, the solution to most of the social dilemmas in his books is to find someone of good character. People of good character can save the world. That's the way Americans feel. It's individualism run rampant. The South is still a region apart. Its values are different. It's far more conservative, as it was in the 19th century. It's distinctive. It's no longer, I think, defined by race, but it is defined by conservative cultural values, and among them, first and foremost, religion and religiosity. It is the Bible Belt, the most religious part of the country.
The South is as much a riddle to me as it was to Dickens. Its religiosity is sincere, but it's also a mass of contradictions. Here at this southern church is a preacher who embodies them. Kenneth Blanchard is a former policeman and US Marine, and a sincerely religious man, a reverend. But he's also a vocal apologist for guns and the right to bear arms, a view he has promoted through his website and book, Black Man with a Gun.
As a black American, as an African American, you have a person whose descendants were once slaves in this country, who's now teaching others how to do something that his ancestors could not do, to be in the church, which is another part of our freedom of speech, freedom of religion. In this church, where they celebrate God and love and life, our freedoms are also respected and loved. And that one of those is the right to keep and bear arms.
I don't think I'm going to be very good at this.
I bet you are. I can always tell immediately what you know about what you do when you first grab a firearm. The very best shots are the ones who have never touched a firearm in their life.
Easy peasy.
Owning a gun does not equal murder, does not equal killing. There's 100 other reasons for having one other than being a criminal. You see where the X is? You want to put this on the X. Smooth on the trigger. Let the whole shot be an expression. Just let it just flow.
On your hat, it says black man with a gun. Explain that to me.
I want to make this so that when you hear black man with a gun in America, it doesn't mean anything anymore to this white man with a gun or a Spanish person with a gun. And almost anybody who owns, collects, hunts, or has a firearm becomes a black man with a gun.
It's very difficult to know what to think about Kenneth. I hate guns. I can see that they have a use, but I do not believe what Ken believes. And I never shall. But I can see that he believes it. And the way he handled that gun, almost tenderly, it was remarkable. And again, it's another instance of where America is so confusing, and where I come face to face with my enemy, and I like him.
And it's done.
In 1976, in the bicentennial of the United States, I recall a magazine asked intellectuals all over the world to comment on what they liked best and what they liked least about Americans. And there was a very interesting comment from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, famous Latin American writer, who said, "What I like best about Americans is they understand themselves extremely well. What I don't like about Americans is they don't understand anyone else. And Americans don't care to understand anyone else. Their assumption is the rest of the world is just like us. And what's the evidence for that? Well, if we let them, they would all move here."
I'm turning round now, as Dickens did, and heading towards Pittsburgh. Coming south into the land of slavery, for Dickens, was an expedition not of pleasure. It was a time when the disillusionment of his experience with America was in sharper and sharper focus. And for me, it has not been quite the same. When I come to Washington, I feel I'm in the land of the enemy. But they taught me it's not as simple as that. You can't really talk about the enemy like that, because the enemy are people. Travel should make you grow. It should be a way of enlarging your horizons and in a sense of finding yourself. And even at 63, which is what I am now, I'm doing it.
And there's more from Miriam next Tuesday at 8:30. Next tonight, an insight into Black Africa's most populous country, which by now should be the superpower of the developing world. Hotspots in Nigeria in a moment.
Here I am about to embark on the Delta Queen, which is a paddle steamer, very much like the boat that Charles Dickens would have sailed up and down the Mississippi when he came in 1842. They still use the paddles, and I'm going to spend one night on this boat. Here is the Ohio River, and when I wake up in the morning, it'll be the Mississippi.
I ask my love to take a walk, just a little ways with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. Steamer Delta Queen will be departing the port of Paducah. All ashore for visitors on last and final call.
Lakes of the Ohio,
These Western vessels are unlike anything we are in the habit of seeing on water. They have no mast, tackle, rigging, or any other such boat-like gear. Except that they are in the water, they might be intended to perform some unknown service high and dry upon a mountain top.
Following in the footsteps of my literary hero, Charles Dickens, I'm continuing my journey of a lifetime throughout the United States of America. As he did on his epic journey of 1842, immortalized in his book American Notes, I've sailed across the Atlantic, explored the eastern seaboard, and spent my time with an assortment of Americans of all persuasions. The Midwest was an area of the country which was not particularly to Mr. Dickens' liking. This part of my voyage will take me to the westernmost point of Dickens' route, St. Louis, Missouri, where I will cast a Dickensian spell on a class of 9th graders.
Rejection!
And visit a prairie nearby where Dickens took the decision to turn around and begin his long journey home. When I visit Cairo in the state of Illinois, I will share the lowest point in Dickens' journey and discover more about the town that inspired the Eden of his great satire, Martin Chuzzlewit.
Time to go.
The decline of the day here was gorgeous, tinging the firmament deeply with red and gold, and all the glowing colours of departing day pale inch by inch before the sombre night.
I remember when I was a boy, they were still running the old steamboats, and they would come into my hometown down on the Mississippi River, Greenville, and everybody would run down to the levee to see the old steamboats are coming. You know, they're slow boats, they're wind catchers, but for its day and age, they were just very efficient.
As night fell and the Delta Queen made her way down the Ohio River, I settled in my cabin before joining Captain Buddy Muirhead, his wife Alice, and some of the frequent floaters for a pre-dinner cocktail.
Gosh, I hope I'm going to remember all this.
A perfect time to introduce them to my literary travelling companion.
And on most of the boats that he was on, there was only 40 passengers. And he said they were all very depressed and never spoke to each other, which is not the case, obviously, with us lot.
Nobody says anything to anybody. All are very dismal and seem to have tremendous secrets weighing on their minds. There's no conversation, no laughter, no sociality, except in spitting, and that's done in silent fellowship around the stove when the meal is over.
I'm so glad you're not like Dickens' companion.
That evening, I was to be a guest for dinner at the captain's table.
We want to extend the Delta Queen Steamboat Company's warmest welcome to you. Here's to y'all. May your days be as bright and your hearts be as light as the spray from that old paddle wheel. Cheers. In 1842, steamboating could be hazardous to your health. The early steamboats, we had no laws, and the captains tended to race, because each one wanted the fastest vessel, because he would get the best passengers, the best price, and, you know, the cargo. So they were constantly racing each other. And they would just overload the boiler and blow it up.
I think Dickens was told that aft was safer than fore. Is that right? Would that be correct?
Yes, because the boilers were forward, and get away from the boilers where when they blew up, you would be
So
safe.
he wouldn't be blown up with it?
Right. But the first really viable steamboat out in this part of the country was in 1816, and the country out here was still a wild country. We still had buffalo east of the Mississippi River and all.
What words shall describe the Mississippi, great father of rivers, who, praise be to heaven, has no young children like him? An enormous ditch, sometimes 2 or 3 miles wide, nothing pleasant in its aspect, but the harmless lightning which flickers every night upon the dark horizon.
When did it start to become like a pleasure trip, rather than just to get from A to B?
Really following the Civil War in the 1870s, and that era was the golden age of steamboating when the magnificent vessels like the Robert E. Lee and the Natchez.
The famous ones.
The Grand Republic, J.M. White, yes.
Let's have a nice round of applause.
As I had a captive audience, it would have been churlish not to have shared some tales of Mr. Dickens' steamboating experiences with my newfound friends.
Charles Dickens came to America and he brought his wife along with him. And nobody ever talks about his wife, Catherine, who was a darling Scottish lady. And she bore him 9 children. And when he was 45, he left her for a young actress. Oh, yes. That'll do it. And